Okay, this is document F. We're going to go review the sixth document, document F. Let's start at the top. There's a map. I don't know if you can see the mouse on the screen. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Source map adapted from the Oxford Illustrated History of Christianity by John McManus, Oxford University Press, 1990. There is a much cleaner version of this up on Classroom. Regardless of the class that you're in, there is a much cleaner version of this, and there's other versions of it on the internet if you search uh, St. Paul's Journeys, Travels. Um, so, background note. You should always make sure you read the background notes because they're key to understanding whatever's there. Paul was a Jewish tent maker from the city of Tarsus in modern day Turkey, probably a few years younger than Jesus. Paul never met the preacher. In fact, he was angry about Jesus' claims and he spent several years criticizing those who believed. Then, according to Paul's own account, he saw the resurrected Jesus while traveling on the road to the city of Damascus, and it changed his life. He spent the next 30 years traveling the eastern Mediterranean world, spreading Jesus' teachings, and it is believed that he wrote most of the 13 New Testament letters on his journey in the 50s CE. And of course, that's a map of the Eastern Mediterranean. You can see the boot of Italy on the top left-hand corner. It's labeled. There's the boot of Italy with Rome, and there's Sicily, which is the island at the tip of the boot. And then, of course, next to it, as you move to the east of the map, and you should be able to see the compass rose in a big white part. The white part is the ocean or the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. If you move to the east of Rome, of Italy, you will see Greece, and then if you go further east, you'll see Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. And then, of course, moving on to the Middle East, which is where Israel is today, and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. You can actually see one of the rivers. And then, of course, down at the bottom is Egypt, and right below the compass rose is Egypt, and what would be the Arabian Peninsula directly to the east of it. So let's, as I said, the white section is all Mediterranean Sea except for the top right of the box, which is the Black Sea. And so what does this tell us? Clearly, when we're answering the question, why did Christianity take hold in the ancient world? The most obvious answer is because you had this guy, Paul, walking around the Eastern Mediterranean teaching the story of Jesus and telling his truth, his story. And his truth in this is that he saw, for his truth is that he saw he saw Jesus resurrected. The resurrected Jesus appeared to him, and that moved him to, change his critical stance against Jesus to one of complete belief. And so, how does this happen? One of the things you can also say about this is, Paul was a very convincing person, we can assume, because he did it for so long and didn't stop. I mean, his faith kept him going for some of it. But if the parts that aren't told in the box here is kind of the background. For the first 100 years, the people who were following the teachings of Jesus didn't call themselves Christians. They didn't. The idea of Christianity didn't come around until after about 100 something A.D. or C.E. And so this idea that these people, were considered Christians back then, they weren't. What Paul was doing running around, because this was before they were called Christians, was he was talking about this guy, Jesus. And he was talking about how he had changed his view. But more importantly, he was talking about Jesus being the Messiah. And this is, again, this is like kind of like the let's tie everything together moment in understanding why Christianity took hold in the ancient world. Because when Paul's going around, he's not just talking about the teachings or Jesus and Jesus' life. He's talking about the Good Samaritan story, the story that where Jesus was, crucified, how he was resurrected, but also telling the other things about everyone being the same, the equality of it, and the idea that when you die you go to a heaven that's a great place, and that the reason why you can is because this being called Jesus sacrificed himself to open up the gates of heaven. So Paul's going around and doing this, and in each place he's stopping at, when he sits down to have a meal, because that's one of the things he did as a traveler, people would invite him into a meal, and just to pause on this storyline, why would you do that, right? Because you think today, especially in the world of COVID, why would you want to have a stranger sitting at your dinner table, blah blah blah? Well, because many of the strangers that you're worried about carried not so much a disease, they carried other information. They carried information like what was going on in a few towns over. Most people didn't live more than a couple towns over. So the idea of bringing a traveler who was passing through town, Paul might spend a week in one town or more, because he'd have a free meal more than likely, because, here he wasn't some kind of like, he wasn't like he was seen as a religious person. He was seen as a respected person, and many of the letters would catch up to him, and he would respond to them. And so, like, his story spread of who he was, people looked forward to him coming through, because he was like almost like a rock star to some of them. Paul's coming to town next. He should be here in the next month. I can't wait. I'm going to have him over for dinner the first night. He's going to be at my house. I have the best house in town. So, it wasn't just he was getting like the average person. He was also drawing attention from some of the wealthier groups of people. Although more than likely they were not going to have him if it was a very heavily Roman town, because of the previous document we talked about the ideology, and Christians did have a very quote unquote bad view for the Romans. The Romans saw them as competition and dangerous. For the longest time. Remember, we talked about the persecutions and stuff, the scapegoating on the Christians. So it's not, it wouldn't be respectable necessarily. But then again, there's a lot of people out there who didn't care about being respectable, and they were usually the lower classes and the middle classes and the wealthy who had money but never were respected because they weren't of noble status. So a lot of those people would be willing to take Paul in, because when Paul comes in, he's saying, hey, even though you're not a noble, you're just as good as these nobles, these senators, these aristocrats, these patricians. That's what Paul is saying. It's a message that people want to hear. And so, why does his message spread? Well, it's because, one of the reasons is because people who were going around talking about Jesus had a message that people wanted to hear. They longed to hear. In comparison to a society in which there's a strict class structure, and one of the groups of people who were always discounted, and they're considered equal to the peasants of the Middle Ages. They were called the head count, the cape censi, the head count people of the ancient Romans. They were the people who were the 95%, or the 90%, probably closer to 85% of the people who weren't wealthy, and were the ones who were living off the grain dole, or getting grain from the government at a cheap price. They were the people who were living in the apartments, the apartment complexes, the insulars of ancient Rome. They were the people who were living very, very, paycheck to paycheck type of thing, like you see even in today's society. So poverty is nothing new to the world, and people who are struggling day to day is nothing new, and people looking for a better life is nothing new. and people listening to a preacher, because that's what Paul was, coming around and talking about, hey, this life may be tough, but the next one's going to be easier, is a message that people gravitate to. And so no matter what your religious belief is, the message that Jesus was teaching, I mean, one of the things that we've talked about, that you've heard me talk about, I'm sure, is the scene, and one of the messages that Paul preaches is when when Jesus is walking one day with his disciples, and they find a woman who's an adulteress, and she's about to be stoned to death, which was the penalty, and the local rabbis, the priests at the who had passed judgment on her, along with all the people watching, said, "Who, what would you do, Jesus, with this woman? And what would you do? Because she's an adulterer. What should she do?" And Jesus said in that line, the famous line, he says, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." In other words, he's saying the equality thing. You're all guilty of sin, and this woman is guilty of sin as well. But she's this message of Jesus is, we need to. You don't have a right to knock her just because she's a woman. You don't have a right to put her down, to kill her because she's a woman, because that's what stoning would do, would kill her. Instead, you have no right to do that because you're just as guilty of some other sin. And so that's the kind of message that people gravitated to. That's why, one of the things, and this is going a lot longer than I thought it would, but in a book I was recently reading, there's this selection from it where and you've heard me talk about this a lot with the different people, women being treated as if they were nothing, and they were acted as if women didn't count for anything, where a husband could kill his wife if she stepped out of line. A woman didn't have a right to, question her husband. And if she did, she could, by questioning him, that would be rights for him to, kill her, and he would never ever go, be in trouble for killing her, because she was clearly in the wrong, because you can't talk back you can't talk back to your husband. So this is from a quote section from Colleen McCullough on her First Man in Rome series. It's completely fictional dialogue, but the sense is still the same that I've been talking to you about. Why were women so more likely to be Christians and stick by their faith than men? One of the reasons is the story I just told you about Jesus and the stoning. Here's another one about two Roman senators, the patricians, the upper class of ancient Rome, talking to each other, it's not a real conversation, because this conversation never really happened. But again, this is the intent, the message that I was telling you about before. So perhaps they were talking about a friend, another nobleman. Scarus, who's the Principus Senatus, the head of the Senate, says he's a weakling. Said Scarus, talking about his son. Said Scarus to Strong, perhaps a good wife might help him, said Numidicus, the other senator. Scarus stopped and turned to face his friend. He said, now that's a thought. I hadn't earmarked him for anyone yet. He's so grossly immature. Have you someone in mind? And his friend says, my niece, Dalmaticus, she's a girl, and she'll be 18 in about 2 years. I'm her guardian now. That dear, so-and-so is dead. What do you say, Marcus Aurelius? Is it a deal? And then, Scarus says, yes, it's a deal. So the point is, here they are talking about a woman as if she's cattle, as she's property. And they're cutting a deal, saying, hey, maybe this woman would make him be a stronger man because he's a weakling. He's a wuss, and so by getting him in there to getting him a good strong wife, maybe that'll make him stronger. Maybe getting him married will make him stronger. So they just cut a deal to say, yeah, we'll let them get married. Whatever her feelings are, whatever personal feelings are immaterial. If she and there's another scene in it where another paterfamilias says to the woman, to his daughter, he says, "You are going to marry so and so." She says no, and he says, "Okay, then you won't be given any food, you won't be given any drink, you won't be allowed out of your room until you agree." She spent a whole week, 2 weeks there, something like that. I think it was, they gave her some water because they didn't want her to die, but she was stuck into this tiny little room with nothing to entertain her, anything. And she stayed there until she finally broke. No showers, no cleaning. I mean, they didn't shower. No bath, no books to read, no, the smallest amounts of food. Everything. She was cut off from the world. So, when women hear Paul talking about this guy Jesus, and then, people say, well, that's not real. That didn't happen. And then Paul says, oh, Jesus was real. I saw him. I saw him on my way to Damascus. I saw him appear, the resurrected Jesus. Today we look at that and say, oh, we look at that and say, the 21st century eyes say, oh, that's, that could be fake. That could be not real. We're skeptical because we live in a world where, we can see comic book heroes come to life and Star Wars come to life on the screen, and we think, well, the idea of having somebody appear, resurrected, I mean, it's not that hard to believe. But in the ancient world, that was something very believable. And, a lot of these people, it wasn't just about, are you worth my believing? It was the idea of, this is real. This is something of faith. And, touching on what faith means to people, just to give you an idea, whether you think faith is real, whether you are a believer of some religion or not, just remember that one of the biggest, igniters of war in the history of the world has been religion of one kind or another. The Protestant Reformation kicked off a tremendous amount of warfare all across Europe and beyond. And even was one of the reasons why our country was founded, because people sought religious freedom from other groups. They sought religious freedom here in America. So the idea that whether you believe in the faith or not of one religion or another is not material to this conversation. What is material is the impact that religion has had on the world. I'm at 18 minutes. By the way, if you've listened to this the entire way, good for you. For the record, YouTube doesn't count, or YouTube does count at different levels of this, but just because you don't watch it all the way through does not mean they didn't count this. For the record, YouTube does a serious count. And they, those of you who haven't been watching this, guess what? It's going to catch up to you. Because those of you who have listened this far are now going to have the secret answer that I didn't tell you about at the beginning. The secret answer is going to be, well, actually, it's not going to be at the end. It's what I gave you before. I already gave you the answer. So if you listen to that part, you're going to get it. So those of you who jump to the end, tough noogie. It's not here. Take care of yourselves. Have a great day. I guess you're going to have to listen to the whole darn video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.